The ballroom at the Peninsula Beverly Hills was filled with the kind of people who smiled for cameras and whispered when they thought no one was listening. Marianne Carlisle stood in a gold sequin gown that caught the light with every breath. Her daughter Sofia pressed against her side in a black velvet dress that matched the seriousness in her eyes. To everyone watching, they looked perfect. Mother and daughter. Elegant. Composed. But Sofia's small hand was trembling as it gripped Marianne's arm, and when she leaned close to whisper, her voice carried a weight no 7-year-old should know. "Mommy," she breathed, her lips barely moving. "Daddy was on the phone again last night. He told someone that his girlfriend knows how to move money without anyone noticing. He said when you're gone, everything will be easier." Marianne's heart stopped. Not if. When. She didn't gasp, didn't pull away, didn't let the shock register on her face. Around them, Los Angeles's elite chatted about art auctions and summer homes in Montecito, champagne glasses clinking like wind chimes. Her husband Evan stood across the room in his tailored Tom Ford suit, laughing with a tech CEO, looking every bit the successful venture capitalist who'd built portfolios worth hundreds of millions. Looking like a man people trusted. Marianne smiled at a passing colleague and kept her voice light. "Did Daddy see you, sweetheart?" Sofia shook her head, braids swaying. "I was hiding behind the door. He thought I was asleep." That single detail changed everything, because it meant Evan didn't know his plan had been exposed. It meant Marianne had something most people in her position never got: time. She excused herself politely, guided Sofia toward the restroom, and locked the door behind them. In the mirror, she saw a woman she barely recognized anymore. Elegant, poised, successful in her own right before marriage had slowly, quietly erased her from her own life. She had been a financial analyst once, before Evan convinced her that motherhood was more important. Before her name started disappearing from investments she'd helped build. Before our money became his empire, and she became the beautiful accessory who hosted dinners and smiled for charity galas. She knelt down and took Sofia's face in her hands. "Listen to me, baby. Everything is going to be okay. But I need you to be very brave and very quiet about what you heard. Can you do that?" Sofia nodded, eyes wide and trusting. Marianne kissed her forehead and stood, smoothing her dress. When they returned to the ballroom, Evan was waiting with that smile she'd once loved and now saw clearly for what it was: a mask. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pulled her close for a photo, whispered how beautiful she looked. And Marianne smiled back, because she understood now what most people learn too late. The most dangerous betrayals don't come with warning signs. They come with compliments, with kisses, with promises that everything is fine while your world is being dismantled piece by careful piece. This wasn't a marriage falling apart. This was an execution being planned. And the only question that mattered now was whether she would wait to be erased, or whether she'd start fighting back before he realized she knew. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether you've ever trusted someone who was quietly planning your destruction. Because this story isn't just about one woman's fight. It's about recognizing the moment when silence stops being kindness and becomes survival. And what happens when someone underestimated finally decides to protect herself. The drive home from the peninsula felt longer than the 12 miles from Beverly Hills to their Pasadena estate. Sofia sat quietly in the back seat, watching the city lights blur past the window, and Marianne kept her hands steady on the wheel even though her mind was racing through every conversation, every dismissal, every time Evan had told her she was overthinking or being emotional. Their home sat at the end of a tree-lined street in San Marino, the kind of neighborhood where hedges were manicured and secrets were kept behind iron gates. Spanish Revival architecture, imported tile, a pool that reflected the San Gabriel Mountains. Beautiful, isolated, perfect for a man who needed privacy while dismantling his wife's life. Evan's car was already in the driveway. Marianne carried Sofia inside, moving through the motions of bedtime with practiced calm. Bath, pajamas, story. But when she tucked the covers around her daughter's small frame, she asked the question that had been burning in her chest since the ballroom. "Baby, how many times have you heard Daddy talking like that?" Sofia's eyes dropped. "A few times. He talks to her late at night. Sometimes he goes into his office and locks the door." "Her." Marianne kept her voice gentle. "The lady. I heard him say her name once. Lena." Marianne kissed her daughter's forehead and turned off the light, but her mind was cataloging everything. Lena. Late-night calls. Locked doors. A girlfriend who knew how to move money. This wasn't just an affair. Downstairs, Evan sat in the living room with a glass of scotch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when she entered, smiled that easy smile. Good event tonight, he said. Morrison's interested in the healthcare fund. Could be a solid Q2. Marianne poured herself wine she wouldn't drink and sat across from him. Sofia seemed tired. I think the late nights are catching up with her. Kids, Evan said, as if that explained everything. He set his phone down. You look beautiful tonight, by the way. That dress was perfect. There was a time when compliments like that made her feel seen. Now they felt like stage directions. Look beautiful. Play the part. Don't ask questions. Thank you, she said. He studied her for a moment, and she wondered if he could see the shift, the crack in the performance she'd been giving for years. But his expression remained pleasant, unbothered. I'm heading to San Francisco on Wednesday, he mentioned casually. Meetings with a few portfolio companies. I'll be back Friday night. Okay. He kissed her cheek on his way upstairs, and Marianne sat alone in the living room, the city lights of Los Angeles twinkling in the distance through floor-to-ceiling windows. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Instead, she opened her laptop and created a new email account under a name Evan wouldn't recognize. Then she began documenting everything she could remember. Dates. Conversations. The moment 3 months ago when her access to their investment dashboard had suddenly required maintenance. The property in Napa that had been purchased with her inheritance but now appeared under an LLC she'd never heard of. The patterns were there. She just hadn't wanted to see them. By dawn, Marianne had a timeline. By breakfast, she had a plan. And by the time Evan came down in his running gear, kissing her forehead and commenting on traffic, she had made a decision that would change everything. She was done reacting. She was done trusting. And she was done being the woman who smiled while her life was stolen. Because Evan had made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated the woman he married. The financial analyst who'd once built models that predicted market crashes. The strategist who'd walked away from a career because he'd convinced her family mattered more. She had believed him then. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Marianne met Evan Carlisle 9 years ago at a conference in Boston, back when she was a rising analyst at a boutique investment firm, and he was a partner at a venture capital fund making waves in the tech world. He'd approached her after her panel on emerging markets, complimented her insights, asked if she'd like to continue the conversation over dinner. She'd said yes. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Within a year, married in a ceremony at the Four Seasons with 300 guests and coverage in the society pages. Within 2 years, she was pregnant, and he was suggesting she take time off to focus on family. You're brilliant, he'd said, holding her hands across the table at Nobu Malibu. But you can always go back to work. Our child only gets one childhood. It had sounded reasonable, loving, like he valued her in a way her career never could. So she'd stepped back, taken the leave, let her name fade from the industry she'd worked so hard to break into. And slowly, quietly, Evan had taken over everything. At first, it was small. He handled the taxes because it was easier to have one person manage it. He opened investment accounts in his name because his firm offered better rates. He bought properties through LLCs structured for tax efficiency. She hadn't questioned it. Why would she? He was her husband. They were building a life together. But looking back now, Marianne could see the architecture of control, how every financial decision had been routed through him, how her name had been quietly removed from assets she'd helped fund, how conversations about money were always redirected, simplified, treated as his world that she didn't need to worry about. You're overthinking, he'd say whenever she asked about account access. You don't need to stress about numbers, he'd remind her when she mentioned wanting to review their portfolio. Trust me, he'd said 1,000 times. And she had. Now, sitting at the kitchen island while Evan was on his San Francisco trip, Marianne pulled up every document she could find. Bank statements, property records, investment disclosures. What she found made her stomach turn. Their home, purchased with her inheritance and his earnings, was titled solely in his name. The Napa property, her idea, her family's money for the down payment, now belonged to an LLC called Westridge Holdings. She'd never heard of it. Their joint investment account had been closed 8 months ago. Funds transferred to an account she didn't have access to. Even the car she drove was leased under a company she wasn't part of. On paper, Marianne Carlisle owned nothing. She scrolled through her phone, found old emails from when they'd first bought the house. She'd wired $200,000 from her personal savings. The confirmation was right there. But the title? Only Evan's name appeared. Her hands shook as she clicked through more files. Every asset, every account, every piece of their financial life had been structured to exclude her. And she had signed papers along the way, trusting him when he said it was standard, or for tax purposes, or just a formality. She thought about the woman she used to be, the analyst who would never have signed documents without reading them, the professional who'd built financial models for companies worth billions. How had she let this happen? But she knew the answer. It had happened slowly, with love as the anesthetic, with trust as the weapon, with a husband who smiled and kissed her forehead and made her feel like worrying about money was beneath her. Evan returned from San Francisco on Friday with flowers and a story about successful meetings. He poured wine, asked about Sofia's week, mentioned they should plan a trip to Maui. Marianne smiled and played along. But that night, after he fell asleep, she went into his office. The door was usually locked, but he'd gotten comfortable. Careless. Inside, she found what she was looking for. A folder marked Personal contained documents she'd never seen. Property transfers, account statements, and a legal memo from an attorney she didn't recognize, outlining strategies for asset protection in the event of marital dissolution. The date on the memo was 14 months old. He'd been planning this for over a year. Marianne photographed everything with her phone, returned the folder exactly as she'd found it, and went back to bed beside the man who'd been systematically erasing her from her own life. She didn't confront him. She didn't ask questions. Because she finally understood, this marriage wasn't falling apart. It had been a strategy from the beginning. And the only question now was whether she could build her own plan faster than he could execute his. The surveillance started so gradually that Marianne almost missed it. First came the new security system Evan installed throughout the house. Cameras positioned in every room except the bedrooms and bathrooms. For safety, he'd explained after a neighbor's home was burglarized. With everything going on in LA, I want to make sure you and Sofia are protected. She'd thought it was thoughtful. Now she understood it was monitoring. Then there was the app he'd asked her to install on her phone, a family locator that would let them keep track of each other. Just in case something happens, he'd said. So we always know where everyone is. She'd downloaded it without hesitation. Now she realized he could see everywhere she went. And then there were the subtle financial changes that accelerated after his San Francisco trip. The credit cards that suddenly declined at Whole Foods with a text saying there was unusual activity. The bank account that required his approval for withdrawals over $500. The investment dashboard she'd finally tried to access, only to find her login credentials no longer worked. When she'd asked about it, Evan had been dismissive. The system's been upgraded. I'll get you new access next week. Next week never came. Instead, he started asking questions. Casual ones. Where had she gone that afternoon? Who had she talked to at Sofia's school? Why did she need cash when everything could be charged to their account? Just curious, he'd say with that easy smile. But Marianne was learning to hear what he didn't say. She started testing the boundaries. One morning, she drove to a coffee shop in Glendale instead of her usual spot in Pasadena. By the time she got home, Evan had texted, "Everything okay? Saw you were in a different area." Another day, she withdrew $400 from an ATM, the maximum the account allowed without his authorization. That evening, he mentioned it over dinner. "Saw you took out some cash. Big purchase. Just wanted some on hand," she'd said lightly. He'd nodded, but his eyes had lingered a beat too long. The walls were closing in, and he was making sure she knew it. One night, Marianne deliberately left her phone at home and walked to a nearby park. She sat on a bench for an hour, just breathing, just thinking without the weight of surveillance. When she returned, Evan was waiting in the driveway. "Where were you?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. "Your phone's been here the whole time. I was worried. Just went for a walk. Needed air." "Without your phone?" He stepped closer. "What if something happened? What if Sofia needed you?" It was framed as concern. But Marianne heard the message. "Don't disappear. Don't go anywhere I can't track." She apologized, promised it wouldn't happen again, and she began to understand the full scope of what he'd built. This wasn't just financial control. It was a cage. every movement monitored, every dollar tracked, every deviation from routine noted and questioned. He was building a case, she realized, documenting erratic behavior, unusual spending, instability. If she fought back openly, he'd use it against her, paint her as unstable, unfit, a danger to Sofia. So Marianne did what she'd learned to do best. She smiled and played the part. But she also started building her own invisible infrastructure. She opened a new bank account using her maiden name at a small credit union in Burbank, far from their usual institutions. She rerouted statements to a P.O. box she rented under a friend's name. She bought a second phone with cash and kept it hidden in the garage, using it only when Evan was out. She documented every instance of surveillance, every declined card, every questioning text, every camera angle, and she started reaching out. First, to an old colleague from her analyst days, someone who owed her a favor. "I need information on an LLC called Westridge Holdings." She'd texted from her burner phone. The response came back within hours, owned by Evan Carlisle. Sole member. Established 14 months ago. Multiple properties held under it. Want details? Yes. The details arrived in an encrypted email. Property in Napa. A condo in San Diego. A commercial building in Santa Monica. All purchased in the last year. All funded through accounts she had no access to. All hers by law, since they were acquired during marriage. All hidden from her systematically. Marianne saved everything to a cloud account Evan didn't know existed. Then she made the call she'd been avoiding. Law offices of Patricia Chun. The receptionist answered. "I need to schedule a consultation," Marianne said quietly, sitting in her car outside a Target in Alhambra, far from anywhere Evan would track. "It's regarding a divorce." "Of course. Can I get your name?" Marianne hesitated. Once she said it out loud, there was no going back. "Marianne Carlisle," she said finally. "And I need someone who specializes in high-asset cases involving financial concealment." There was a pause. Then, "I'll make sure Ms. Chun knows. How does Tuesday at 10 work?" "Perfect." Marianne ended the call and sat in the parking lot, watching families load groceries into their cars, living ordinary lives where trust meant something. She thought about Evan at home, probably checking the app to see where she was, making mental notes about her movements. He thought he was 10 steps ahead. He had no idea she'd started running a different race entirely. And the thing about surveillance? It only works if the person being watched doesn't know they're performing. Marianne had spent years being underestimated. She wouldn't make the mistake of underestimating herself. Patricia Chin's office was located in a discreet building in downtown Los Angeles, the kind of place where privacy was built into the architecture. No flashy signage, no visible cameras, just a brass plate beside an elevator that required a code to access. Marianne arrived 15 minutes early, parked 3 blocks away, and walked in without her phone. She'd left it at a yoga studio in Pasadena, creating the alibi Evan would see on his tracking app. The receptionist led her to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Patricia Chun entered moments later, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an air of someone who'd heard every story and believed very few excuses. "Mrs. Carlisle," she said, extending a hand. "Tell me what's happening." Marianne had rehearsed this moment a dozen times, but when she opened her mouth, the words came out raw and unfiltered. "My husband is planning to divorce me, and he's been systematically removing my access to everything we own. I didn't realize it was happening until my daughter overheard him on the phone saying that when I'm gone, everything will be easier." Patricia's expression didn't change, but she pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes. "When did you first become aware of this?" 2 weeks ago. But looking back, it's been happening for over a year." "What assets are we talking about?" Marianne pulled out the folder she'd assembled. Property records, account statements, documentation of every asset she'd been locked out of. Patricia reviewed each page methodically, her pen moving across the paper. "This is a community property state," Patricia said finally. "Everything acquired during the marriage belongs to both of you equally, regardless of whose name is on the title. But that doesn't mean the fight will be easy. I know. Your husband is a venture capitalist with significant resources and connections. He'll hire excellent attorneys. They'll paint you as unstable, claim you're not fit for custody, argue that you've been out of the workforce too long to support yourself." Marianne's stomach tightened. "I know." Patricia leaned forward. "But here's what they won't expect. that you documented everything, that you understand exactly what he's done, and that you're willing to fight smart instead of loud. What does that mean? It means we don't file first. We let him think he's in control. We build an airtight case, forensic accounting, witnesses, documentation of every asset he's hidden. And when he finally files, thinking he has the advantage, we hit him with a response so comprehensive it leaves no room for manipulation. Marianne felt something shift in her chest. Hope, maybe. Or just the relief of not being alone anymore. How long will that take? Months. Maybe longer. Can you maintain the appearance of normalcy that long? I've been doing it for years. Patricia smiled faintly. Then we'll need to move carefully. First step is getting a forensic accountant to trace every dollar. Second is securing evidence of his relationship with this Lena person, not because infidelity matters legally in California, but because it establishes a pattern of deception. Third is making sure you have financial resources he can't access. I opened an account he doesn't know about. Good. Start moving small amounts into it. Nothing that triggers alerts. We'll also need to document his surveillance tactics. The cameras. The tracking app. Every instance of control. Marianne nodded, taking notes of her own. One more thing, Patricia said, her voice softening slightly. This is going to get worse before it gets better. When he realizes you're not cooperating the way he expected, he'll escalate. More surveillance. More control. Possibly attempts to paint you as an unfit mother. I know. Do you have support? Family? Friends? Marianne thought about her mother in Boston, her sister in Seattle. People she drifted away from during the marriage because Evan always had a reason they shouldn't visit, shouldn't call so often, shouldn't interfere. Not really, she admitted. Then build it. Quietly. You're going to need people who can testify to your character, your stability, your capability as a mother. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end, Marianne had a strategy, a timeline, and something she hadn't felt in months: clarity. She paid Patricia's retainer in cash and left through a side exit. On the drive back to Pasadena, she picked up her phone from the yoga studio and saw 3 texts from Evan. How was class? Thinking about dinner. Sushi. Love you. She responded with practiced ease. Class was great. Sushi sounds perfect. Love you too. And as she drove through the city where she'd built a life that was never really hers, Marianne understood something fundamental. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen incrementally, silently, with her own complicity, because she'd been taught that love meant trust, and trust meant not asking questions. Evan had built a trap, but he'd forgotten that the woman he married had once been the kind of analyst who saw patterns others missed. And now she was going to use every skill he'd convinced her to abandon. The forensic accountant Patricia recommended was a woman named Rita Valdez who operated out of a modest office in Culver City and had a reputation for finding money people swore didn't exist. She'd worked with the FBI on fraud cases and had a particular talent for unraveling complex corporate structures designed to hide assets. Marianne met her on a Thursday morning, again without her phone, again creating an alibi at a coffee shop where Evan's tracking would show her stationary for 2 hours. Rita was direct. Your husband is sophisticated, but sophisticated people make patterns, and patterns can be traced. Over the next 3 weeks, Rita worked through every document Marianne had gathered and requested more. Bank statements going back 5 years, tax returns, investment disclosures, credit card bills, anything that showed money moving. What she found was staggering. Evan hadn't just hidden assets. He'd created an entire parallel financial infrastructure. Multiple LLCs, offshore accounts, investments routed through entities Marianne had never heard of. And at the center of it all was a name that kept appearing: Lena Russo. She's not just a girlfriend, Rita explained during their 4th meeting. She's a financial strategist. Worked at Goldman Sachs before going independent. Specializes in asset protection and wealth structuring. Marianne felt the ground shift beneath her. So this wasn't just an affair. No, this was a partnership. She helped him restructure everything to exclude you legally while maintaining the appearance of a joint financial life. The documents told the story. Lena had been involved for at least 18 months. Her name appeared on filings for Westridge Holdings as a consultant. She'd signed off on the account restructuring that locked Marianne out. She'd even been listed as a beneficiary on a life insurance policy Evan had taken out 8 months ago. A policy worth $3 million. He took out life insurance on you, Rita said carefully, sliding the document across the table. Marianne stared at the paper. Her name, her signature, forged, she was certain, because she had no memory of signing it. And Evan listed as the beneficiary, with Lena as the contingent. This is a red flag, Rita continued. Combined with your daughter overhearing him talk about when you're gone, this suggests intent beyond just divorce. The words hung in the air, heavy and terrible. You think he would actually? Marianne couldn't finish the sentence. I think you need to be very careful. And I think we need to make sure every piece of this is documented and filed with people who can act if something happens to you. Marianne left Rita's office feeling like she was living in someone else's nightmare. The man she'd married, the father of her child, wasn't just trying to divorce her. He was trying to erase her completely. That night, Evan came home with flowers and news that he'd booked a weekend trip to Catalina Island. Just the two of us, he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she stood at the kitchen sink. Sofia can stay with your mom. We need time to reconnect. Marianne's blood went cold. Her mother was in Boston. Sofia had never stayed there alone. And Catalina Island was accessible only by boat. That sounds lovely, she said, keeping her voice light. But Sofia has a birthday party this weekend. Maybe we can plan something for next month. She felt his grip tighten slightly before he released her. Sure, next month. But the look in his eyes told her everything. He was getting impatient. The timeline was accelerating. Marianne texted Patricia from her burner phone that night. He's trying to get me alone on Catalina. I think we're running out of time. The response came back within minutes. We need to move faster. Can you come in tomorrow? At Patricia's office the next day, the strategy shifted. We need to protect you immediately, Patricia said. I'm filing for a restraining order based on the surveillance, the financial control, and the life insurance policy. It won't give us everything, but it will create a legal record that you felt unsafe. He'll know I'm fighting back. He already suspects. The question is whether we act before he does. Marianne thought about Sofia, about the life they'd built that was really a prison she hadn't recognized, about the man who smiled and brought her flowers while planning her disappearance. File it, she said. The restraining order was submitted that afternoon. By evening, Evan would be served. Marianne picked up Sofia from school and drove not to their house in San Marino, but to a hotel near LAX that she'd booked under her maiden name. She texted Evan from her regular phone. Took Sofia to the beach. Be home for dinner. Then she turned off the phone, removed the SIM card, and waited. At 6 p.m., Patricia called the burner. He's been served. And he's furious. His attorney already called demanding we withdraw it. What did you say? That we'd see him in court. Marianne, you need to stay somewhere safe tonight. He knows now. The mask is going to come off. Marianne looked at Sofia, who was watching cartoons on the hotel bed, oblivious to the fact that everything had just changed. I know, she said quietly, because Lena Russo wasn't the real enemy. The real enemy was the man who'd built a life designed to trap her, who'd weaponized love and trust, who'd turned marriage into a slow-motion disappearance. And the only way to survive was to stop running from that truth and start fighting back with everything she had. The divorce papers arrived 3 days after the restraining order, delivered by a process server to the hotel where Marianne and Sofia had been staying. She signed for them while her daughter ate breakfast, the official dissolution of her marriage handed over in a manila envelope that felt both heavy and inevitable. Evan hadn't wasted time. The filing painted a picture Marianne had been expecting but still stung to see in legal language. She was described as emotionally unstable, financially irresponsible, and potentially unfit for primary custody. He requested full physical custody of Sofia with supervised visitation for Marianne. He claimed she'd abandoned the marital home. He listed assets that conveniently excluded everything hidden in the LLCs Rita had uncovered. It was a masterclass in manipulation. But Patricia Chun had been preparing for exactly this. He filed first thinking it gives him control of the narrative, Patricia explained in an emergency meeting. What he doesn't know is that we've spent the last month building a case that dismantles every claim he's made. The response they filed 2 weeks later was devastating in its precision. It included forensic accounting reports showing every hidden asset, documentation of the surveillance and financial control, testimony from Sofia's pediatrician that she showed no signs of neglect or instability, Character references from Marianne's former colleagues describing her competence and reliability. And, most damning, evidence of Lena Russo's involvement in restructuring the marital assets to exclude Marianne. But the piece that changed everything was the life insurance policy. Patricia had filed a motion to freeze all assets pending investigation, citing the policy as evidence of potential intent to harm. The judge granted it immediately. Within 24 hours, Evan's access to the hidden accounts was suspended. The properties held in the LLCs were placed under court supervision, and a custody evaluator was appointed to assess both parents. Evan's attorney called for an emergency hearing. The courtroom in downtown LA was smaller than Marianne expected, the kind of place where lives were decided in fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable chairs. Evan sat across the aisle in a navy suit, his jaw tight, his eyes cold when they landed on her. Beside him was his attorney, Marcus Webb, a man with a reputation for winning and a client list that included tech CEOs and entertainment executives. Beside Marianne sat Patricia, calm and unshakable. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judith Morales, reviewed the filings with an expression that gave nothing away. "Mr. Webb," she said finally, "your client filed for divorce, claiming his wife abandoned the home and demonstrated erratic behavior. Yet Mrs. Carlisle filed a restraining order 3 days prior citing surveillance, financial control, and fear for her safety. Can you explain the timeline?" Marcus stood. "Your Honor, Mrs. Carlisle filed that restraining order in bad faith, attempting to gain advantage in what she knew would be contentious divorce proceedings." Bad faith. Judge Morales looked over her glasses. She documented months of surveillance. Financial accounts locked without her knowledge. A life insurance policy she claims she didn't sign. That doesn't sound like bad faith. That sounds like someone protecting herself. My client installed security cameras for their family's protection, and the tracking app on her phone, for safety purposes, given the increase in crime, and removing her access to their joint investment accounts. Marcus hesitated. That was a technical issue being resolved. For 14 months. The judge's tone was dry. Quite a technical issue. She turned to Patricia. "Miss Chun, you've filed a motion to freeze assets. What's the basis?" Patricia stood. "Your Honor, our forensic accountant discovered that during the marriage, Mr. Carlisle systematically transferred community property into entities designed to exclude Mrs. Carlisle. Additionally, he took out a $3 million life insurance policy on her without her knowledge, naming himself as beneficiary. Combined with statements overheard by their daughter about Mrs. Carlisle being gone, we believe there's sufficient cause for concern." Judge Morales looked at Evan. "Mr. Carlisle, did you take out a life insurance policy on your wife?" Evan stood, his voice smooth. "Yes, Your Honor. It's standard financial planning for." "Without her knowledge?" A pause. "I don't recall whether she signed the paperwork." "You don't recall." The judge made a note. "Here's what I'm going to do. The asset freeze stays in place pending a full accounting of all marital property. The restraining order remains active. Custody will be evaluated by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and until that evaluation is complete, we're establishing a temporary custody arrangement of 50-50, with exchanges facilitated through a neutral third party." Marcus objected. "Your Honor, my client has serious concerns about his daughter's welfare." "Based on what evidence?" "A mother who protected herself, who documented abuse, who hired a lawyer." Judge Morales closed the file. "I've seen this pattern before, Mr. Webb. A controlling spouse gets caught, files for divorce claiming the other party is unstable, and hopes the court will reward them for their foresight. Not in my courtroom." She looked at Marianne. "Mrs. Carlisle, you're going to need to continue documenting everything. Stay somewhere safe. Follow the custody arrangement to the letter, and understand that this is going to be a long process." "I understand, Your Honor." "Good. We'll reconvene in 60 days. The gavel came down, and Marianne felt something she hadn't felt in months. Solid ground beneath her feet. Outside the courthouse, Evan approached with Marcus beside him. "This isn't over," Evan said quietly. Marianne met his eyes, the same eyes that had looked at her with love on their wedding day, that had watched her sleep, that had calculated her disappearance. "I know," she said, "but you don't control the story anymore." She walked away, Patricia beside her, and for the first time since that whisper in the parking lot, Marianne understood something fundamental. Evan had filed first thinking he'd already won. He built his case on the assumption that she would be too afraid, too broken, too isolated to fight back. But he'd miscalculated, because the woman he'd tried to erase had spent her whole career finding patterns in chaos. And now she'd found the pattern in him. The custody evaluator, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, was a clinical psychologist who specialized in high-conflict divorces. She interviewed Marianne first, in an office in Santa Monica that felt deliberately neutral. Soft colors, comfortable chairs, no judgments visible on the walls. "Tell me about your marriage," Dr. Mitchell said, pen poised over her notepad. Marianne had practiced this, not lying, but framing, telling the truth in a way that didn't sound bitter or vindictive, that simply described what had happened. She talked about meeting Evan, about the early years when everything felt equal, about the gradual shift after Sofia was born, when our decisions became his decisions and her career became something they'd revisit later, about the surveillance she hadn't recognized until it was everywhere. Dr. Mitchell took notes, asked follow-up questions, and gave nothing away. "What about Sofia?" she asked. "How would you describe her relationship with her father?" "He loves her," Marianne said honestly. "But he's been using her as a source of information. She's 7 years old, and she's learned to be careful about what she says around him." "Can you give me an example?" Marianne described the night Sofia had whispered about the phone call, about how her daughter had checked first to make sure Evan hadn't seen her listening. Dr. Mitchell's expression shifted slightly. "That's concerning behavior for a child that age." "I know." The evaluation included sessions with Sofia, with Evan, and with both parents together. Marianne followed every instruction perfectly, arrived on time, answered every question honestly, stayed calm even when Evan's attorney tried to paint her as vindictive. But what changed everything was what Rita Valdez discovered during the forensic accounting. "There's a pattern," Rita explained during a meeting in Patricia's office. "Every time Evan started a new relationship, there was a significant financial transaction within weeks." She pulled up a timeline on her laptop. 2019, he meets someone named Amanda Fletcher. 2 weeks later, he opens a new LLC and transfers $400,000 into it. The relationship ends after 3 months. The LLC remains. 2021, he's involved with someone named Julia Chun, according to his credit card statements. Within a month, he takes out a line of credit against your house and moves the funds to an offshore account. Relationship ends. Money stays offshore. And now Lena Russo. Relationship begins in late 2023. By early 2024, he's restructured every major asset to exclude you. Marianne stared at the screen. He's done this before. Multiple times. It's a pattern of using relationships to justify major financial moves that benefit him exclusively. Patricia leaned forward. "Which means Amanda and Julia might be willing to talk. If he used them the same way he's using Lena, they might have information about his methods." It took 2 weeks, but Rita tracked down Amanda Fletcher in San Diego. She was a real estate attorney who dated Evan briefly before what she described as a weird ending. "He wanted me to help him set up some property trusts," Amanda explained over coffee in La Jolla. "Said it was for tax purposes. I helped him with the paperwork, and then suddenly he ghosted me. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, it felt transactional." "Did he ever talk about his wife?" Marianne asked. Amanda's expression turned uncomfortable. "He said you guys were separated, that you'd agreed to split but hadn't made it official yet. I didn't know you were still living together." The same story, the same lie. Julia Chun, when they finally reached her in Seattle, had a nearly identical experience. "He needed help moving money for an investment opportunity," she said over a video call. "I worked at a hedge fund at the time. I didn't realize I was helping him hide assets from his wife." Both women agreed to provide statements, and both confirmed what Marianne had suspected. Evan didn't just use relationships for emotional companionship. He used them as tools to advance his financial interests. The pattern was undeniable. When Patricia presented the evidence to the court at the next hearing, Marcus Webb objected strenuously. "Your Honor, my client's past relationships have no bearing on a pattern of financial manipulation." Judge Morales interrupted. "I disagree. This establishes motive and methodology. It shows that Mr. Carlisle has repeatedly used romantic partners to facilitate financial transactions that exclude his wife." She looked at Evan. "Mr. Carlisle, you've had multiple opportunities to provide a full accounting of your assets. You've claimed technical difficulties, lost paperwork, accounting errors. But what I'm seeing is a deliberate pattern of concealment. Evan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Here's my ruling, Judge Morales continued. Mr. Carlisle, you have 30 days to provide a complete and accurate accounting of all assets, including those held in LLCs, offshore accounts, and any entities you have ownership interest in. Failure to comply will result in sanctions and a presumption that Mrs. Carlisle's accounting is accurate. She turned to the custody evaluation. Dr. Mitchell has submitted her report. After interviewing both parents and observing interactions with the child, she recommends primary physical custody be awarded to Mrs. Carlisle, with visitation for Mr. Carlisle. The court accepts this recommendation. Marcus stood. Your Honor, we'd like to request. Request denied. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel came down. Marianne sat very still, processing what had just happened. She had primary custody. The assets would be accounted for. Evan was losing control. Outside the courtroom, she saw him talking urgently with Marcus, his face red, his composure finally cracking. Patricia touched her arm. Don't celebrate yet. He'll appeal. He'll drag this out. But we're winning. I know, Marianne said. Because she'd learned something in this process. Justice wasn't fast. It wasn't dramatic. It was documentation and patterns and professional testimony that slowly, methodically revealed the truth. And the truth was that Evan Carlisle had spent years building a system of control. But systems could be dismantled, one hearing at a time. The final hearing took place on a clear morning in March, 6 months after that whisper in the school parking lot had changed everything. The courtroom was the same, Judge Morales presiding. But the atmosphere had shifted. Evan's legal team had shrunk. Marcus Webb had withdrawn after Evan stopped paying his bills. The replacement attorney was younger, less experienced, and visibly overwhelmed by the documentation Patricia had assembled. Over the past 60 days, Rita's forensic accounting had uncovered everything. Every LLC, every offshore account, every property. The total marital assets came to $18.7 million, far more than the $3 million Evan had initially disclosed. More damning was the evidence of how he'd used that money. Payments to Lena Russo totaling $340,000, described as consulting fees, but with no corresponding work product. Transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands timed precisely with relationship milestones. And the life insurance policy, which investigators confirmed bore a forged signature. Your Honor, Patricia began when it was her turn to speak. This case represents a textbook example of financial abuse and manipulation. Mr. Carlisle systematically excluded his wife from marital assets while maintaining the appearance of a partnership. He used surveillance to control her movements. He locked her out of accounts she had legal rights to. And he enlisted romantic partners to help him conceal wealth that belonged to both parties. She presented the final accounting, page after page of evidence that showed not just what Evan had done, but the deliberate methodology behind it. Mrs. Carlisle seeks an equal division of community property, primary physical custody of their daughter, and spousal support while she reestablishes her career. She also requests Mr. Carlisle be held responsible for her legal fees, given that this litigation was necessitated by his concealment. Evan's attorney tried to argue, claimed the offshore accounts were for legitimate business purposes, suggested that Marianne had known about the LLCs all along, painted Lena as simply a financial consultant. Judge Morales listened with an expression that had grown increasingly skeptical over the months of hearings. When it was Evan's turn to testify, she asked him directly, Mr. Carlisle, why did you forge your wife's signature on a life insurance policy? I didn't forge, he started. We have a handwriting expert's report. The signature is not hers. Why did you forge it? Silence. And why did you tell multiple romantic partners that you were separated from your wife when you were still living together? More silence. And why did you remove your wife's access to investment accounts without her knowledge or consent? Evan's attorney stood. Your Honor, my client. I'm asking your client, counselor. Mr. Carlisle. Evan looked at her, and for the first time, Marianne saw him without the mask. No charm, no easy smile. Just a man who'd been caught and had no explanation that would sound reasonable. I was protecting my assets, he said finally. Your assets? Judge Morales's voice was sharp. Or community property that legally belonged to both of you. My work built during a marriage, in a community property state, using resources that were jointly owned. She made a note. Here's my ruling. The courtroom went silent. The community property will be divided equally. That includes all assets held in LLCs, offshore accounts, and any other entities Mr. Carlisle has ownership interest in. The total value is $18.7 million, which means Mrs. Carlisle is entitled to $9.35 million. Evan's face went pale. Primary physical custody of the minor child is awarded to Mrs. Carlisle. Mr. Carlisle will have visitation every other weekend, supervised for the first 6 months by a court-appointed monitor. Your Honor, Evan's attorney tried to object. Given the surveillance tactics and the life insurance policy, supervised visitation is appropriate. If Mr. Carlisle demonstrates appropriate behavior, we can revisit in 6 months. She continued. Mr. Carlisle will pay spousal support in the amount of $15,000 per month for 3 years, allowing Mrs. Carlisle to re-establish her career. He will also be responsible for all of Mrs. Carlisle's legal fees, which currently total $287,000. Marianne felt tears threatening, but kept her composure. Additionally, Judge Morales said, I'm ordering Mr. Carlisle to undergo therapy focused on control and manipulation behaviors before unsupervised visitation will be considered. The court takes very seriously the emotional impact this case has demonstrated on the minor child. She looked directly at Evan. Mr. Carlisle, you had every advantage in this case. Resources, connections, professional expertise. What you didn't have was honesty. You spent years building a system designed to exclude and control your wife. This ruling is a direct consequence of that choice. The gavel came down. This court is adjourned. Marianne stood on shaking legs. Patricia squeezed her hand. Across the aisle, Evan was arguing with his attorney, his voice rising before Marcus, still present for the final hearing, guided him out. Outside, the March sun was bright and warm. Sofia was waiting with Marianne's mother, who'd flown in from Boston for the ruling. When she saw Marianne, she ran over. Mommy, Grandma took me to get ice cream. Marianne knelt down and held her daughter close. That sounds perfect, sweetheart. Patricia stood nearby, professional, but with a small smile. You did it. We did it, Marianne corrected. What's next? Marianne looked at the courthouse behind her, at the building where her marriage had officially ended and her life had officially restarted. We go home, she said. Not to the house in San Marino that had been a gilded cage, but to the apartment she'd rented in Pasadena, small and safe and entirely hers. Where Sofia could be a child instead of a spy. Where Marianne could rebuild the career she'd abandoned. Where trust wouldn't be weaponized and love wouldn't be surveillance. Let's go home, she repeated. And for the first time in years, she knew exactly where that was. The apartment in Pasadena wasn't much to look at from the outside. A converted craftsman on a tree-lined street near Caltech, where graduate students and young professionals lived quiet lives. But when Marianne unlocked the door for the first time as the official resident, it felt like sanctuary. 2 bedrooms. A kitchen with windows that caught morning light. Hardwood floors that creaked in a friendly way. No cameras. No tracking apps. No invisible walls closing in. Sofia ran through the empty rooms, her voice echoing, claiming the smaller bedroom as hers and already planning where her bookshelf would go. Marianne stood in the living room and breathed. Just breathed. The settlement had come through within weeks of the final ruling. $9.35 million transferred into accounts only she controlled. The Napa house, purchased with her inheritance, returned to her name exclusively. And monthly support payments that gave her time to figure out what came next. She thought about calling her old colleagues from her analyst days. Testing the waters. Seeing if the skills she'd set aside were still valued. But first, she needed to remember who she'd been before she became someone else's asset. The first month in the apartment was about basics. Furniture. Routines. Getting Sofia settled into her new school where nobody knew about the divorce or the court case or the mother who'd nearly disappeared. Sofia's pediatrician said the supervised visits with Evan were appropriate. She needs to see that adults can handle conflict without putting her in the middle, Dr. Chin explained. Right now, she's learning that her voice matters. That when she spoke up, you listened and protected her. The visits happened at a family center in Glendale, facilitated by a therapist. Evan arrived on time, played appropriately with Sofia, and left without incident. But Marianne could see the effort it took him, the restraint, the performance, the awareness that he was being watched. Good, she thought. Let him know how it feels. By the second month, Marianne had reconnected with her former mentor from her investment firm days. They met for coffee in downtown LA, and the conversation started cautiously. I heard you went through a difficult divorce, her mentor said carefully. I did. Are you thinking about coming back to the industry? Marianne considered the question. Was she? The world had changed in the 9 years since she'd stepped away. New regulations, new technologies, new players. But patterns were still patterns. Markets still moved on human behavior. Analysis still required the ability to see what others missed. I think so, she said finally. But on my terms this time. Her mentor smiled. We could use someone with your skills. Contract work to start. Build back at your own pace. That sounds perfect. The work started small. A few hours a week analyzing portfolios for high-net-worth clients. Building models. Identifying risks. Remembering how good it felt to use her mind for something other than survival. Sofia adjusted to the rhythm. Mornings getting ready for school. Afternoons with homework and playdates. Weekends exploring Pasadena, the Huntington Library, the Rose Bowl, the hiking trails in the San Gabriel foothills. They were building something new. Not the life Marianne had imagined when she'd married Evan all those years ago, but something better because it was real. One Saturday afternoon, they were at the farmer's market in Old Town when Sofia stopped at a flower stand. Can we get some for our table? She asked. Our table. Our home. Our life. Of course, sweetheart. They walked back to the apartment carrying sunflowers and fresh bread, and Marianne realized she couldn't remember the last time something this ordinary had felt this profound. That evening, after Sofia was asleep, Marianne sat on the small balcony overlooking the street. She thought about everything that had led here. The whisper in the parking lot. The surveillance she'd finally recognized. The attorney who'd listened. The judge who'd seen through the performance. She thought about the women who wouldn't get this ending. Who didn't have resources for lawyers or forensic accountants. Who believed their husbands when they said everything was fine. Who stayed until it was too late. And she made a decision. She started writing. Not for publication, just to process. About financial control disguised as protection. About surveillance framed as caring. About the slow erosion of self that happened when someone systematically removed your access to your own life. She wrote about the warning signs she'd missed. The red flags she'd ignored. The moment she'd finally chosen to believe her daughter instead of her husband. And she wrote about what came after. The documentation. The patience. The strategic restraint that had seemed impossible but had ultimately been necessary. Months passed. The contract work became regular consulting. The consulting became an offer to join a boutique firm as a senior analyst. Marianne accepted, negotiated her terms, and started rebuilding a career she'd thought was lost. Sofia's therapy sessions showed progress. She was sleeping better, laughing more, starting to trust that this new stability was real. The supervised visits with Evan transitioned to unsupervised after he completed the court-ordered therapy. He was careful now, respectful of boundaries. Whether that change was genuine or just pragmatic, Marianne didn't know and didn't particularly care. What mattered was that Sofia was safe. A year after the final ruling, Marianne stood in a conference room in downtown Los Angeles, presenting an investment strategy to a room full of executives. Her analysis was sharp. Her recommendations were sound. And when the meeting ended, the COO approached her. That was excellent work. Where have you been the last decade? Marianne smiled, learning some important lessons about trust and documentation. The woman laughed, not understanding the full weight of the statement. But Marianne did, because she'd learned that survival wasn't about being the loudest or the angriest. It was about being patient and thorough and willing to play the long game when the stakes were your life and your child's future. That evening, she picked up Sofia from school, and they stopped at their favorite taco place in South Pasadena. Sofia talked about her day, about her friends, about the science project she was planning. Normal things. Safe things. The kind of childhood that should never have been threatened. Mommy, Sofia said as they walked to the car. Yes, sweetheart. I'm glad we have our own home now. Marianne squeezed her hand. Me too. Because this was victory. Not the court ruling, though that had mattered. Not the settlement, though it had provided security. But this, walking through their neighborhood, knowing that every door would open with her key, that every account bore her name, that every decision about their life belonged to them. Evan had tried to erase her, but she'd documented, strategized, and fought back with the same skills he'd underestimated. And now she was here, reclaimed, whole, free. That night, after Sofia was asleep, Marianne sat at her desk and opened the document she'd been writing. The story of what had happened, not for revenge or exposure, but as a record, a map for anyone else who might find themselves in a marriage that was really a slow-motion disappearance. She added a final section about the small apartment in Pasadena, about starting over, about the quiet triumph of an ordinary Tuesday morning where you wake up in a home that's truly yours. And then she saved the file, closed her laptop, and looked around the living room. Small, safe, hers, the life she'd reclaimed, one documented day at a time.